Thanks for joining us back for our final edition of Matthews Reads Earthsea. We're going to be going over the last, I believe, 4 chapters of the book.
Three. 8, 9, and 10.
8, 9, and 10. So yeah, for all of you who have been kind of reading along and following us, this is obviously where we'll start to wrap things up, as has been this Big Read program. We're here in April and finishing things up, and so yeah, thanks for joining us. And Megan, thanks for being alongside for our final chapter review.
Yeah, it's been fun. And for anyone following along, Kyla and I are actually recording this episode in the same room. This is the first time we've recorded this together. We've been doing it over Zoom, but thanks to the wonders of vaccinations,
that's right,
we are now in person. So
yeah, we're seeing each other's faces for the first time in literally a year. So it's really cool.
Yep.
And with that, Megan, do you want to give us a little overview on the 3 chapters that we've read for today's podcast?
Definitely. So this is going to be a short overview because honestly, 8, 9, and 10 really... and not a lot happens. It's more so, a lot does happen, but really it can be summed up very simply. And I think we're going to talk about more so today, instead of focusing on the individual events, what this means in context of the whole novel and what we've read so far. But
Absolutely.
To get into just a quick summary as a reminder. So Ged seeks out the shadow after Ogion kind of encourages him to do that, and the shadow flees from him. Ged pursues it in a small sailboat until it lures him into a fog where the boat is wrecked on a reef. Ged recovers with the help of an elderly couple marooned on a small island since they were children. The woman gives Ged part of a broken bracelet as a gift. Ged patches his boat and resumes his pursuit of the creature into the East Reach. On the island of Ifish, he meets his friend Vetch, who insists on joining him. They journey east far beyond the last known lands before they finally come upon the shadow. Naming it with his own name, Ged merges with it and joyfully tells Vetch he is healed and whole.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like you said, that's so all the book clubs I've met with, almost every kind of local review I've got is, the ending, and I wouldn't go as far to say anticlimactic, but it's not, you can tell this is book 1 to a series. She's kind of holding Le Guin, is sort of holding things back at the end. Still an awesome, ties everything up, pretty concise, but yeah, not as like high flying and plot heavy as the other 2 chapter reviews that we've done. But still, I really do like the way this book is wrapped up.
I think what's interesting about it is, I think so often in a lot of stories, that climax is met with, the whatever it is that is the antagonist still in pursuit of the protagonist, but the protagonist deciding, I'm going to face it, I'm going to let it come to me. This is different because Ged spends the whole chapters 8, 9, and 10 actually seeking out the antagonist, rather than waiting for it to come to him. And there's a huge power shift that happens right in chapter 8. And I think Ursula says it best when she writes on page 170. Ged says, Ogion had been right. The shadow could not draw on his power so long as he was turned against it. And I just thought that was, a very concise way to put this moralistic idea that once Ged realized that he had power over the shadow as the shadow had power over him, because he is the shadow. The shadow is the darkness of him.
Yep.
It's this idea that, your inner light can overcome your own darker tendencies as long as you acknowledge and accept that you have those darker tendencies, that they exist.
Yeah.
And I think that him chasing it is kind of that acknowledgement, even though he doesn't really realize, he's not acknowledging it till the end chapter, which we'll get into that later.
Right.
But yeah, I just thought that was a very concise, and that was honestly one of the, even not having gotten to chapter 9, chapter 10, I kind of knew where it was going, but when I read that statement, I was like, oh, yep, this is definitely, the shadow is him. It is part of him.
And that was really well said. And that's probably why I love the ending so much, is that the shadow is him. And like you said, what a transitional chapter 8 is. I mean, first off, it's just titled Hunting. It goes from hunted to hunting. And yeah, the quote you read is really where you see the full transition, where like Ged is motivated and that's what I really liked on that part, is that's a really the fact that the shadow is him, and that we can't run from our own fears and problems. That's such an age-old, like really unique archetype we see in a lot of like when we did our hero's journey presentation for our Bellman, that was such, and when I was doing my research, like every hero has that moment where they can either keep running for their fear and nothing really ends up happening, or they, eventually you have to face it to overcome and kind of make it to that next step. And so I really like the fact that that's how Le Guin kind of snuck that part in there, to where it's kind of a part of the hero's journey arc, but in really its own kind of unique way. But here's where we kind of see that you're facing your own fear, but in a physical, literal shadow form.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's just brilliant to me.
And I think that's one of the things I love about the fact that, she wrote this obviously intending for a kind of a young adult audience. I mean, I think all ages enjoy this novel. It's definitely not just for young adults, but I think what I appreciate about her writing is she wants to make those morals clear. She doesn't want to be overly vague about it, because she wants, no matter the age of people, to kind of really see clearly what is the meaning of this novel and what can you take away from it in your own life. And I just think it's really well done in that young adult genre. Yeah.
And kind of crazy how it, even as adults, it's still pretty, there's still a pretty good connection there of like those same kind of just moral values almost that she's presenting in this kind of fantasy way. But it's really just as simple as like facing your own fears, dealing with your own ego, and What did you think of the elderly couple? That has been probably the number one question mark I get from readers through this whole Big Read program of what was the point of that? And to be honest, I don't have an answer for them, so I wanted to get your opinion on.
I don't know that I have a good answer either, because it felt so random and so odd. But I will say, Ursula has, throughout the novel, emphasized the importance of community and what happens when you are removed from community. I mean, Ged, throughout, when he is removed from the people that he loves and cares about and that care about him, that is when he has the most difficult time, handling anything. He struggles greatly. It's only when he reconnects with Ogion that he gets his strength back. It's when he reconnects with Vetch that he really, I think Vetch being with him at the end of the journey is part of what makes him successful. The Otak, I think that losing the Otak was, I think, a huge blow to Ged and his confidence in his abilities. And so I think this old couple maybe serves as this reminder of what happens when we lose ourselves, when we disconnect from community. They're still sweet and gentle, but I think there's this part in the novel where Le Guin writes, they had forgotten that any other humans existed, and they're fearful of everything, and they don't understand what is good and what isn't. They don't trust Ged. They don't have those judgment skills. And I think maybe there's this statement of we do suffer, even maybe if we don't realize it, when we are isolated from others.
Yeah, that actually is by far the best response I've got for what that, and especially I've now just kind of, as you said that, made a little, you mentioned how much Le Guin emphasizes community and culture, and one of the last times that I was speaking with the book club, we were talking about how Ursula's parents, who were involved in like university, they were like academia professors, and her father was a professor of, what is it when like the study of culture, and anthropology, thank you. Her father was a professor in that, and specifically in the California, Oregon area, like Native American culture and community. And so I think that idea of the isolation and kind of creating these not negative characters, but like
they're not bad. It's just that they've totally lost who they are, and they live in this sense of perpetual fear of anything that's different,
very primal.
And I mean, they're like, aren't they like living off of a well that's only giving them salt water?
And Ged's the one that gives them the gift of water.
And so
they're living a very like survival life.
Yes, and so and I just think that she's just showing this huge, this idea that that's kind of what happens when you are removed, because and he enters into that fog, and I think I think it then hammers home to Ged how important it is to escape the fog, to escape the isolation, to get back to community, because this is a glimpse of what could happen if he didn't. He could forget himself. He could forget everyone else. And that's, and then to be honest, the shadow would be who Ged is, because the shadow is already off impersonating Ged to other people, as we find out later. So I don't know. That's kind of just my biggest crack at it. I think I need to read through it a few more times. So it's definitely, I wouldn't write a thesis about it, but
no, that's another theory I had, and I also think this one's pretty accurate too, is that, maybe they're reoccurring characters in the series. They, they do sort of, I don't know. Yeah. The way she writes the characters, it's like, she kind of ends things with the, you might be seeing him again kind of feeling.
Yeah.
I could be completely wrong. For anyone out there who's read the whole series, you'll know. But these are just guesses. But yeah, but I do. Yours has a kind of deeper impact that I think is probably pretty accurate. So yeah. So then he moves on and finally finds his good friend Vetch.
Yes. And
on the land of Ifish, if I'm correct. The
yes.
name of the chapter.
Yeah. Over
on the east part of the map. My one takeaway from that chapter was, to me that was sort of the cherry on top of how important names really are. There's that intimate moment where Vetch and Ged share their real names. Because by this whole time, only the reader knows his name is Ged. The majority of Earthsea knows him as Sparrowhawk, because, if you know something or someone's true name, you can have power over it. And so you kind of finally see in a live sense, like the intimacy of exchanging names. It's like the ultimate form of trust in this world.
Well, and it's so important because Vetch had seen the shadow as Ged, and the shadow hadn't responded to him, didn't recognize him, and Vetch, I think, said he could sense a darkness or something like that, to that effect.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And so Ged telling him his real name, and that in return, just, I think for Vetch especially, made him feel like this really is Ged. This is, because only he would know that.
Right, so it's also a kind of strategic thing, but like only, of all the characters in this book, it was really fun to watch the relationship between those two wizards, and then to kind of have that culminating moment. Because I think even my first time through, I still, the whole name concept hadn't really stuck until that part, and that kind of highlighted that. But yeah, that's kind of my one takeaway with that. There's obviously a lot of, if you're into naval kind of things, this is definitely your section or chapter of the book. What's his boat's name? Lookfar. Yeah. I thought that was a good boat name. Probably should have used that maybe in some of our flavors or something. But yeah, I liked the scenery with him sort of chasing after this shadow on the open sea and kind of the dark, misty side of Earthsea that no one really goes to. Like, it was really well described. I was just talking to a kid yesterday who read it in Canyon Hills, and he was saying that ending was his favorite part just because of how intense that, like, and how kind of scary the water makes it, or the description of the water that they're on, like from a like kind of nature perspective to it, it was a really, just kind of a really well put final scene for how kind of daunting it was.
Definitely. And the other thing that I took from the chapter 9 with Vetch coming back in is, Vetch, when Vetch says he's going to go on the journey and Get says, no, I don't want you to endanger yourself. And Vetch says, I've been with you since the beginning. I need to be with you in the end. And I think that emphasizes this kind of cyclical journey that Le Guin continues to emphasize. Vetch was there at the beginning when he ripped open the universe and the shadow crawled out. And Vetch feels very much the need. And Vetch even says, I know I'm not going to fight this shadow, but I need to be there. I need to see it. I need to be with you.
Yeah.
And it's I think that's just so great, because so much of Ged's journey is us seeing him go through all of these actions as a child, screwing them up horribly. And then after the shadow comes in, we see him almost in a way reenact a lot of those moments, but doing them correctly.
Yeah.
And so, I know that we're going to have Marcia Mittman speak about Taoism and the circle specifically. And so I just kind of want anyone listening to, one, mark your calendars for May 13th, May 13th, because that's when we'll be dropping that keynote with Marcia on our Facebook and website, but also to point out the fact that you see this kind of circular pattern throughout the novel, and I think Marcia's going to have a lot more insights on that in her keynote.
Absolutely, yeah, kind of that rebirth stage that we see Ged go through. That's something that she's definitely going to be kind of highlighting, and there's a lot more to that. And I could try to speak on it, but it won't make near as much sense.
We can wait for Marcia.
Yeah, so just wait for Marcia. But yeah, sort of all these kind of Eastern traditions that are tucked into this book that Ursula was definitely a fan of kind of incorporating. But kind of back to this overall plot. That's sort of it. He finally teams up with Vetch and Vetch's sister, who I kind of thought there was something there with Ged and Vetch's sister.
Yeah, I did too, which there might be in the future novels.
I don't know if wizards, do they ever mention if wizards are allowed to marry in this world?
I don't know. This was a very platonic novel overall. There's literally no romance.
And there's
really.
What, 2 female characters essentially?
And the only married couple that they mention is I can't remember the name of that place.
Oskill?
Where it's the lady,
evil king and the girl from his past. Yeah, so other than her and Vetch's sister and, I guess the old woman on the island, that's it for first off, female characters. And then, in terms of intimacy, romance, or anything, you see a lot of friendship and bonds or the relationship between Ged and Ogion, but it's not until this chapter where I was kind of is Ged and her, is that going to develop into a relationship? But didn't really get anything more from that. I think because Vetch was suggesting it, right? Or something along those lines. Yeah. So. Well,
and I, just as a sidebar note, I think we could have an entire discussion someday about female authors, especially in the fantasy genre, because you have Ursula K. Le Guin, you have J.K. Rowling, who still choose to emphasize male characters over female characters. Yeah. I always find that interesting. I think some of it is, for the longest time, fantasy was really viewed as a male genre. And so not only would women tend to try to hide their gender by the way they did their pen name, Ursula less so. Although I think Ursula had a cool enough sounding name that
she's got a good ring. Ursula.
But J.K. Rowling definitely tried to hide her gender in the way she did. But I also feel like they would specifically choose a voice of male characters because they were worried that if they did female characters, it might not be accessible to a male audience. So that's one of those things where, again, that is a conversation for another day for sure, but something that I never can stop thinking about when I read these novels, about how just even when we have fantasy novels written by females, they tend to still focus around male characters. So
I will say, I spoke to a student at Black Hills State who they read this in their classroom, and he had told me he had read the whole series, and apparently I believe like the second, third, and fourth, the protagonist is a female. So it's funny that she chose, for her first novel to not, but then as the series goes on, I think it turns into I think Ged becomes kind of older and wiser and is the Ogion, and I think his apprentice might end up being a female.
That's what you do. You got to lure him in with a male character, and then you can introduce the female into there.
I guess it just shows the times, too.
Back to chapter 10. I thought that it was cool that the place that they sailed past was called the Last Lands. Is that what it was?
Yeah, that was cool.
I thought that was a fun little name. But we were kind of talking about the description of that climactic moment when he confronts the shadow. He's walked out over the water, which has turned to sand at this point. And I found this kind of analysis of the faces that he sees the shadow go through that I wanted to share. It says, the faces Ged sees in the shadow are symbolic of various points in his journey. His father represents his neglected youth. Jasper represents his unchecked arrogance. Petchfrey represents his failure to know his limits, and Skyr represents his extreme isolation. Ged comes to understand that all these points of darkness are part of what make up his whole being, and that he would not be who he is without them. Once he accepts that the shadow is his echo, he knows its name because it is his own name.
Kind of blew my mind. I had not really connected any of that, to be honest, especially the dad part. I kind of forget that he really did kind of have an abandoned childhood, and the more I look back on Ged's whole journey, the more I am sort of because at first I was kind of like, Ged's a little jerk at the beginning. I was like, I wouldn't say I wasn't a fan, but but when I look back on his childhood and this whole journey he's gone on, I start to sympathize a lot more, and so when he kind of comes to this concluding moment, it really is a little more eye-opening for the whole journey that he's actually been on.
It is, and what I love about this is him overcoming the shadow is not about shunning these dark parts of himself. It is about accepting them.
Right.
It is about recognizing that his lightness and who he is now and the person that he's become is not just because of the good choices he's made, but because of the bad choices he's made. And I don't think that excuses the bad choices in our past, but it also shows that we can't live a life where we're fleeing from our darkness, that we're fleeing from our shadow. It's something we have to recognize so that we can work on it, so that we can move past it, so that we can overcome it. And our darkness, just like how, it says that the shadow had no power over Ged when he started chasing it, our darkness has no power over us when we can reconcile it, when we seek that out and say like, okay, I recognize that this was a place where I fell short, so now I'm going to fix it by doing this. And I do think that is such a universal thing, that we want to run away from anything about ourselves that makes us feel uncomfortable. And the only way you actually can overcome it is by admitting that it exists and by facing it head on within yourself. So
no, that's nailing the hammer on the head, or the nail on the head, because the sort of mistakes or vices that we all have, it's kind of who makes us who we are. And once again, Ursula is able to sort of paint that picture perfectly. With that, I kind of want to end on literally the last paragraph in the book. It's one of my favorites, and I think it kind of ties in this whole idea and kind of what we've been talking about today. But it says, to be the man he can be, Ged has to find out who and what his real enemy is. He has to find out what it means to be himself. That requires not a war, but a search and a discovery. The search takes him through mortal danger, loss, and suffering. The discovery brings him victory, the kind of victory that isn't the end of a battle, but the beginning of life. And that just, that really ties things. Sorry, that was the end of the afterword, not the book. But that to me sort of really ties up this whole theme, and kind of what we've been working with on this sort of journey of self-discovery that's sort of in the underlying theme to this whole big read. And just about, especially during the year that we had, I thought from choosing a book perspective that something with a theme like this, our previous book that we did in 2019, Station 11, had a great message, kind of how art survives during an apocalypse. But, during a year like we had, I really wanted something to boost morale. And I really think that at the end of a book like this, you kind of feel like you have the skills to get through that. And the skills are everything that's kind of within you. And so I just love that last little bit. And that's from Ursula herself, kind of telling us about why or what she was trying to do with Ged's journey, and just a great way to end things.
I'm going to share my favorite quote too, which this is in the last chapter, and it's kind of from the point of view of Vetch in a way. Le Guin's describing what Vetch has recognized about Ged's journey and Ged's fight with the shadow. And she writes, and he began to see the truth that Ged had neither lost nor won, but naming the shadow of his death with his own name had made himself whole, a man who, knowing his whole true self, cannot be used or possessed by any power other than himself, and whose life therefore is lived for life's sake and never in the service of ruin or pain or hatred or the dark.
Look at that. I had it underlined too.
Yeah.
That's like the best quote in the book.
I mean,
yeah.
and it's just this idea that it gave him this freedom from anything that was wielding power over him, and not in a reckless way, but in a taking full responsibility for yourself way. And when you take full responsibility for yourself and your actions, you are not going to be in service to darkness, to pain, to anything else, because you are a whole person. You have full empathy. You have this ability now to, you have wisdom. I think that's the best way to put it.
Yeah.
I think that's what wisdom really is.
Yeah, knowledge is power.
Yes, and I think that wisdom is not just knowing things, it's also recognizing that you can be wrong, that you can fall short, that you can make mistakes.
Knowing yourself.
And that is so, both sides are so vital parts of that coin. And I love that, because I think it's a very humbling message, but not in a tear you down way, in an almost uplifting way, because we all fall short. We all make mistakes.
It's so universal.
And to know that when we have the wisdom to acknowledge and recognize our mistakes, to acknowledge and recognize where we fall short, to acknowledge and recognize our shortcomings, it makes us better. It makes us more wise. It makes us more powerful in a lot of ways. So, I think all of us can agree. I don't want to get political too much in this, but we've come off a year where a lot of people feel very strongly about a lot of things. A lot of people have a lot of different opinions. And I think that if we can all approach these discussions with the humbleness that I think Ged ends up getting to, where we recognize our own shortcomings, our own places where we fall short, when we recognize even some of the viewpoints that we can't understand because we haven't experienced that, I think it just makes us more compassionate people. It makes us more wise people. It makes us able to be a part of our communities in a more advantageous way for everybody, including ourselves. And so just kind of connecting it to real life, I think that's one of the things that I feel in this is Ged gives me the courage to acknowledge where I fall short and acknowledge the things that I need to work on, which I think allows me to be a more compassionate and empathetic person when I conquer hard discussions, a lot of which I think we're all having in our daily lives nowadays.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that was really well said and a really good way to end things. You know, we've decoded this bad boy now for about 3 months of just kind of going through, you know, really everything we can. And so I hope, you know, everyone that's been following along has enjoyed this book. And, you know, it really is one of those books that every time I have a new discussion or read through a new chapter, I pick up something new. And, you know, it's been a long time since I've felt that way about a book that I didn't already want to pick myself. Totally random, and you know, I'm so happy that this was what we ended up doing our big read on. And so yeah, I hope everyone kind of can take something from this book, whether it's things that Megan and I found, or maybe things that you picked up on yourself on your own reading. But you know, thanks for following along with us. As Megan mentioned earlier, we've got literally only one more big read program, and it is Marcia Mittman's keynote presentation. So it'll kind of be your final time to see this whole book wrapped up. Hopefully you've had the book finished by now. Ideally, if you're listening to this, you have. And Marcia's going to give us a little bit more of a deeper thesis into a few of the themes we mentioned today. So thank you, everybody. And yeah, stay safe and have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.